You know the mainstream media hates us, right? You know they absolutely hate guys who do what I do. They are able to cover up and hide data and facts that don't support or actually go completely against their agenda and what they're trying to push. Case in point, the CDC being coerced into burying statistics on defensive gun use. I pulled this story from the Reload, and it's a really interesting story that shows how the White House and Senator Dick Durbin's office was able to make a connection from some anti-gun people to get them in front of the CDC, because these people did not like the CDC numbers that were coming out. Remember, the CDC talked about how all they needed to do gun research. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, wants to include gun violence in their stuff because the politicians are trying to get them to do that so that we can call gun violence, as they call it, an actual disease, an epidemic. That way they can pass laws under the existing laws that they already have that say, well, now that it's an epidemic, we got to do X about it. Remember all the things they did to clamp down on America during their pandemic with COVID. That's why the CDC is even involved in what they call gun violence right now in the first place, because it's not a disease. Well, the CDC was looking for additional funding so that they could go out and do research on defensive gun use. Their hopes were that there was not much gun use, defensive gun use out there, and they would be able to debunk the, quote, myth that they like to think it is, that there's not much defensive gun use, so why do we allow Americans to have guns? Now, quick side note here, doesn't matter what their statistics show or anything like that. We have a Second Amendment that's actually in the Bill of Rights that doesn't care what your statistics, whether they're factual or made up, are. So let's just get that out of the way right now. But their hope was they could develop those kinds of numbers and say, aha, see, people don't use guns in self-defense purposes. Well, in fact, they do. It appears that the CDC had numbers out there, and we've talked about these numbers on the show before, from 60,000 times to 2.5 million times. Now, that's a huge disparity, obviously, but that's the numbers that they had out there. Well, there are opportunists out there, and we've talked about this many times. Of course, you know I've talked about it in my book, that there are people that make a lot of money on the anti-gun side. A lot of money. Not like gun manufacturers do. They make their paltry little 5 to maybe 10%. There are people making 60 to 70 to 80% return on all of their money on the anti-gun side. They're actually getting fat and rich off of this. Well, these people want the CDC to use their numbers. Their anti-gun numbers. Their biased numbers. And they didn't like the fact that the CDC was coming up with their own numbers, trying to be unbiased about it, but clearly not unbiased. The CDC never has been. Well, that still wasn't good enough for the anti-gun crowd. Mark Bryant, who is the Gun Violence Archive founder, was really mad about it. And Mark Bryant is trying to sell his own brand right now. He doesn't like the brand of statistics out there that the CDC is using. He says in his own words that the 60,000 to 2.5 million times per year in the United States that Gary Kleck came up with should not be used. In fact, he's quoted in his email saying that 2.5 million number needs to be killed, buried, dug up, killed again, and buried again. It is highly misleading, is used out of context, and I honestly believe it has zero value, even as an outlier point in honest DGU discussions. Now, again, remember, he's selling his own numbers. He wants the CDC to give him, obviously wants the government to give him grant money, but he wants the CDC to give him credibility so that they will use his numbers so that he can rewrite the actual facts based on what he wants them to be, not what they actually are. Now, at first, the CDC pushed back and said, this is what our research finds, and they were being honest about it, at least. I give them credit for that. We're going to stand behind this. Well, that wasn't good enough for them. Again, they are politically motivated, and obviously they have a lot of political clout within the Democrat Party. This organization does. So they kept pushing, and that's when the White House and Durbin gave them access directly to higher-ups in the CDC. Now, Mr. Kleck, who has the numbers of 60,000 to 2.5 million, is a professor at Florida State University's College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. He stood by his research. He said the CDC did not reach out to him for his perspective before making the changes and scraping all of this data and factual information off of their website and canning it. He also argued the removal of the reference to his estimate was blatant censorship. Instead, it was evidence of the politicization of the agency. Quote, CDC is just aligning itself with the gun control advocacy groups. It's just saying we are their tool and we will do their bidding, and that's not what a government agency should do. Now, the irony in somebody like Bryant trying to poke holes in somebody else's numbers and how they gather that data is that Bryant and the gun violence archive that he owns and promotes classifies mass shootings as any shooting where 4 or more victims are injured, compared to the Associated Press definition of 4 or more killed. So the man has already rewritten definitions as how to quantify things. So he's not using apples and apples. Somebody else is using an apple, then he tries to debunk that by using an orange to make his argument. That's not the way things are. You use a common denominator, and he's absolutely not using that. Let's also remember that these are the same types of organizations that want to classify a school shooting as something that happens by gang members at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night a half a block from a college. They pile those into their same school shooting numbers just to get your attention. You want to talk about false data? You want to talk about corrupt data? That's where it exists on that side. Bryant and GVA also twist their numbers. He uses the criteria that the only instances that should be counted are those that are captured by the media or reported to law enforcement. That's it. Now, how in the world can you look at that and think that's accurate? How many times does a person use their firearm, whether it be on a piece of farmland, meth heads trying to cook meth in the woods on your property, and you have to go out there and approach them like that. They come at you and they see that you're armed and they leave you alone. Instances like that. Somebody about to climb in your window and you rack that shotgun slide. Instances like that, in many cases, are not reported. Why? Why report them? Number one, it's not going to be the media, because the media does not consider somebody not getting blown away as being a story. So the media is not going to carry that. Even if you told the media, they're still not going to carry that as a story. That's not a story to them. It's not sexy. There's no blood involved. Law enforcement, why would you call law enforcement on that? Why would you do that? Number one, they're not going to catch the person. Number two, in many cases, they ain't filing a report. Those guys will tell you, we're not going to file a report on that. It's not worth the time for us to spend on the paperwork. So we know that Bryant's own way of collecting that data with the media and law enforcement is not accurate. Now, be patient with me. I want to share one more thing with you guys. If we are going to be honest about defensive gun use, and if we're going to let these people even be a part of the conversation, we've got to take all the data in. We can't pick and choose what data we want. So let's use 2020 homicide data. In 2020, 45,222 people died from gun-related injuries in the United States. Now, this is murders and suicides. It also includes unintentional and involved law enforcement and whose circumstances could not be determined. In that same year, 54% of all gun-related deaths in the U.S. were suicides. That's 24,292 suicides. So let's get that out of the picture. That shouldn't be in that number anyway. 43% were murders with guns. That's 19,384. So we had less than 20,000. If we use the low number that these people still don't like, that Bryant and his crew and the CDC scrubbed, if we just use the 60,000 defensive gun uses a year, that's still 3 times more than gun-related murders in the United States, right? So if you're looking for some kind of a test to say that one is more important than the other, even if you use the wrong number, if you use the worst number that you've got to make your argument on the anti-gun side, it's still 3 times higher than those murders committed with a firearm. Another flaw in your reasoning here, if you're going to use that number of 19,384 to describe murders with firearms in the United States, you and I know, this is actual data out there that you can extrapolate that goes even deeper. We know that probably a good 5,000 to 10,000 of that is typically gang-related murders, right? It is. I mean, it's a common fact. It's a statistical fact. So if you're going to continue to include, to pad your numbers, if you're going to continue to include using gang-related homicides to inflate your gun-related murders, then you should also include your gang-related defensive gun use in your numbers, right? I mean, let's think about it. Why are you using one to offset what the credibility of the other one is? if we're not going to use gang, and I'm being honest here, I'm not trying to make fun here. Gangs are using guns to defend themselves. When there's a drive-by, somebody's usually shooting back. Why isn't that qualified and counted as a defensive gun use? Because again, if you're not going to include that number in your defensive gun use, then why are they in the homicides if you're trying to compare those two groups of numbers with one another to say that one carries more weight than the other? You're lying to yourself and you're lying to everybody else if you pull these numbers out of one and keep them in the other. So let's either pull those out of gun-related homicides or include gang-related defensive gun use in with those defensive gun use numbers.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America. He's over.